When people think about English in Africa, most minds immediately travel to British classrooms, American movies, colonial textbooks, or the strong, proud local accents that have shaped African speech for generations. But quietly, almost invisibly, something unexpected has been unfolding across the continent. A shift so subtle that many didn't notice it at first, yet powerful enough to reshape how millions of young Africans now speak, think, and express themselves in English. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg, from university hostels to call centers, from YouTube videos to Zoom meetings, a different rhythm is emerging, softer, clearer, warmer, and surprisingly familiar. Not British, not American, not Australian, but Filipino. And at first glance, this idea sounds unbelievable, even strange. How could a country thousands of miles away, with no colonial history in Africa, quietly influence how an entire generation communicates in English? But the truth is, this change didn't come with headlines, political power, or global campaigns. It arrived through screens, through voices, through everyday conversations online, and before anyone could label it, millions were already absorbing it, copying it, and making it their own, because what Africans were hearing wasn't just an accent. It was clarity, confidence, and connection. Across Africa, English has always carried weight. It is a language of opportunity, education, professionalism, and access to the global world. Yet for decades, there has been an unspoken struggle whose English is the right one. British English taught in schools, American English heard in movies, Nigerian English spoken proudly at home, Kenyan English shaped by history, or South African English influenced by multiple cultures. This confusion created pressure. Many young Africans felt trapped between sounding too local and sounding fake, trying to imitate Western accents that never quite fit their natural rhythm. But then something changed, not through formal education, but through exposure, repetition, and necessity. Over the past decade, the internet quietly reshaped the global workforce. Freelancing platforms exploded, remote jobs became normal, and suddenly, young Africans were no longer competing only within their countries. They were speaking daily with clients in the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, and Australia. And in those same digital spaces, Filipinos were everywhere, working as virtual assistants, customer service agents, online teachers, digital marketers, community managers, and support specialists, dominating platforms like Upwork, Fiverr, online jobs, and countless outsourcing companies. And every time Africans joined a meeting, listened to a tutorial, or collaborated on a project, they noticed something instantly. Filipinos were easy to understand, not just grammatically correct, but emotionally clear. Their English wasn't rushed, it wasn't aggressive, it wasn't heavy with accent. It flowed gently, with warmth and intention. And most importantly, clients responded positively to it. This wasn't accidental. The Philippines has lived with English for over a century, blending it naturally with local languages, using it not as a symbol of superiority, but as a tool for connection. Filipinos didn't learn English to impress. They learned it to communicate, and that difference shows in how they speak. The rhythm is balanced, the intonation friendly, the pronunciation careful but relaxed. And when Africans encountered this style repeatedly, something clicked. This English felt achievable. It felt human. It didn't demand the loss of identity. It didn't punish emotion. It didn't require pretending to be Western. It simply required clarity and kindness. Slowly, unconsciously at first, Africans began to mirror it, not because they were told to, but because it worked. Filipino YouTubers teaching English gained African audiences. Filipino vloggers speaking casually, yet clearly became models of confidence. Filipino call center training videos circulated in African outsourcing hubs, and before long, accents began to soften, speech patterns shifted, phrases repeated, expressions borrowed, not copied deliberately, but absorbed naturally through exposure. And this wasn't limited to one country. In Kenya, students started practicing neutral pronunciation for online work. In Ghana, customer service trainees studied Filipino-style intonation. In Nigeria, content creators noticed that speaking more clearly brought international engagement. And across the continent, a realization spread quietly. English didn't have to sound British to sound intelligent. It didn't have to sound American to sound global. What made the Filipino influence even stronger was its emotional tone. Filipino English carries warmth, politeness, and approachability. Phrases like "for me," "I think," "it's like," and gentle sentence endings became common because they made conversations smoother, less confrontational, more collaborative, and for Africans whose cultures value respect, emotion, and community, this style felt natural. Familiar and empowering, it allowed them to speak globally without sounding cold or distant. And in a world driven by communication, that advantage mattered. As more Africans succeeded online, landing international jobs, receiving positive feedback, and building confidence, others paid attention. Teachers began encouraging clearer pronunciation rather than forced accents. Training centers introduced neutral English modules, inspired directly by Filipino outsourcing practices. Some African companies even brought in Filipino consultants to train staff on soft skills and communication, not because of prestige, but because results spoke louder than tradition, clients understood them better, projects ran smoother, and opportunities increased. What started as a practical adaptation slowly became a cultural shift. Young Africans on TikTok began speaking with softer tones. YouTube creators adopted clearer diction. Comedians joked about speaking like Filipinos. And audiences laughed not in mockery but recognition, because everyone knew what it meant. It meant sounding professional, global, and confident, and humor became admiration. Admiration became normalization, and normalization became identity. A new kind of African English was emerging, one shaped not by colonial legacy, but by global collaboration. This was not imitation for validation. It was adaptation for survival and success. Africans were not losing their accents. They were refining them, learning how to be understood without being erased. And Filipinos, without ever intending to lead a movement, had provided a blueprint, an example of how the global South could shape global standards, quietly, effectively, and authentically. And this was only the beginning. As the influence of Filipino-style English continued to spread across Africa, something deeper than imitation began to take root. This was no longer just about accent or pronunciation. It was about a new philosophy of communication, one built on being understood rather than being impressive. And this mindset fit perfectly into the realities many young Africans were facing in a rapidly globalizing digital world. Because in online meetings, customer support calls, virtual classrooms, and freelance negotiations, clarity mattered more than pedigree, tone mattered more than tradition, and results mattered more than sounding like a textbook. Across call centers in Kenya and Ghana, trainers began noticing patterns. Agents who spoke more slowly, used polite phrasing, and maintained a calm, friendly tone were receiving higher customer satisfaction ratings, fewer complaints, and more repeat contracts. When supervisors traced the source of these communication styles, they often led back to Filipino training videos, Filipino mentors, or Filipino-led outsourcing models. And rather than resist this influence, African institutions leaned into it because the data supported it. Clients from Europe and North America consistently rated neutral, easy-to-understand accents higher than strong regional ones. Not because they were superior, but because they reduced friction, misunderstandings, and fatigue. In Ghana, language schools began rebranding their courses, moving away from strict British phonetics toward what they called neutral English communication, a phrase lifted almost directly from the Philippine BPO industry. Students were taught to focus on vowel clarity, sentence pacing, polite intonation, and emotional awareness. In Nigeria, online pronunciation coaches started using Filipino phonics as reference points, explaining sounds in ways that felt practical rather than academic. And in Kenya, YouTubers openly admitted that watching Filipino vloggers helped them overcome fear when speaking English on camera, because those vloggers didn't sound perfect. They sounded confident, expressive, and human. This shift also influenced how English was emotionally framed. For a long time, English education in Africa had been rigid, formal, and often intimidating. Mistakes were punished, accents mocked, and fluency tied to elitism. But Filipino-style English carried a different energy. It allowed for pauses, for warmth, for emotion, for humility, and Africans responded to that freedom. They realized English didn't have to erase personality. It could amplify it. And this realization changed not just how people spoke, but how they felt about speaking. The entertainment world reflected this change quickly. African comedians began incorporating Filipino-style English into skits, exaggerating the politeness, the gentle tone, as well as the expressive intonation, and audiences immediately understood the reference. Because they had heard it everywhere online, what started as humor evolved into appreciation. Filipino English became shorthand for professionalism, global exposure, and digital success. And young Africans no longer associated success with sounding Western. They associated it with sounding clear. Even African media began to adapt. Radio hosts softened their delivery. Podcast creators slowed their speech for international audiences. YouTube documentary narrators adopted a more neutral, warm tone, not by instruction but by observation. They noticed which videos performed better globally, which voices retained viewers longer, and which styles attracted international subscribers. And again, the pattern pointed to clarity and emotional accessibility. Educational systems could not ignore the shift either. Some training programs quietly replaced listening exercises that featured only British or American speakers with recordings from Filipino teachers, because students understood them more easily and comprehension improved. In tourism and hospitality, training government-backed programs emphasized polite, neutral accents to better engage foreign visitors, and Filipino trainers were sometimes featured as models of world-class customer communication, not because they were foreign, but because they were effective. At its core, this movement was driven by a simple truth: people want to be understood. For decades, African English speakers were often dismissed or mocked internationally, not because their grammar was wrong, but because their accents were unfamiliar to Western ears. The Filipino model offered a middle ground, a way to sound global without pretending to be someone else, and Africans recognized the opportunity immediately. This wasn't about copying Filipinos. It was about learning from them. There was also a shared emotional experience beneath the surface. Both Africa and the Philippines belong to what is often called the Global South, regions that have historically been underestimated, stereotyped, and overlooked by dominant Western narratives. Filipinos understood what it meant to adapt without losing dignity, to master a global language without claiming ownership over it. And Africans saw themselves in that journey. They saw how the Philippines had transformed English into an economic engine, powering industries like outsourcing, healthcare, education, and digital services, and they wanted to do the same. As more Africans embraced this approach, opportunities expanded. Freelancers landed long-term international clients. Teachers reached global audiences. Content creators broke beyond local borders, and communication became a tool rather than a barrier. And slowly, the narrative around African English began to shift. It was no longer framed as strong or hard to understand, but as evolving, adaptive, and globally aware. Experts observing language trends began to take notice. Some predicted that within a decade, African English would naturally trend toward a more neutral, melodic, and emotionally expressive form, similar to what Filipino English represents today, not as replacement, but as evolution. And this evolution signaled something larger than language. It signaled a redistribution of cultural influence, proof that global standards no longer flowed only from the West outward, but from shared experience across continents. This wasn't a loud revolution. There were no declarations, no policies, no official endorsements, yet millions of voices were changing, one sentence at a time, one video at a time, one conversation at a time. And as Africa continued to find its voice in the global digital space, the Filipino influence remained woven into it, subtle but unmistakable, shaping how confidence sounded, how professionalism felt, and how connection was built. And as this transformation deepened, It became clear that this story was no longer just about Africa learning from the Philippines. It was about the future of English itself. As this quiet transformation continues to unfold, something remarkable becomes impossible to ignore. The Filipino influence on African English is not simply changing how people speak. It is changing who gets to define what good English even means. For centuries, English followed power, shaped by empires, institutions, and Western approval. Accents were ranked, some celebrated, others dismissed. And for a long time, Africans were taught, subtly and directly, that sounding Western meant sounding intelligent, professional, and worthy of being heard. But this belief is now slowly dissolving, replaced by something far more powerful. The idea that English belongs to those who use it well, not those who inherited it first. The Filipino way of speaking English embodies this shift perfectly. It carries no arrogance, no claim of ownership, only utility, warmth, and adaptability. It exists to connect people, not to dominate them. And this philosophy resonates deeply with young Africans navigating a globalized world where communication determines opportunity. For them, English is not an academic trophy. It is a bridge, a skill, a survival tool. And Filipinos have shown what happens when a society fully embraces that mindset, transforming language into access, employment, and dignity. What makes this moment historically significant is that it represents a cultural exchange between two regions often overlooked in global narratives, Africa and Southeast Asia. Neither region set out to influence the other, yet through shared challenges, digital spaces, and human connection, they found common ground. Both understand what it means to be underestimated, to be told your voice is too different, too emotional, too informal, and both have learned that adaptation does not require erasure, it requires confidence. Across Africa today, a new generation is growing up with this understanding. They are not memorizing accents from colonial textbooks. They are absorbing voices from YouTube, Zoom, TikTok, and global workspaces. And those voices sound friendly, clear, respectful, and human. They sound Filipino, inspired, yet unmistakably African, because this evolution is not copying, it is blending. Africans are taking what works and shaping it to fit their own rhythms, cultures, and identities. This is why the change feels natural rather than forced. Young Africans do not sit down and decide to abandon their accents. They simply learn how to soften harsh edges, slow down their pace, emphasize clarity, and speak with intention. And in doing so, they gain confidence. Their fear of speaking English fades, because the language no longer feels like a test. It feels like a conversation. Even cultural gatekeepers are beginning to recognize what is happening. Educators, linguists, media professionals, and communication experts now acknowledge that intelligibility matters more than imitation, that emotional connection matters more than accent purity, and that the future of global English will be shaped by those who use it daily to build relationships across borders, not those who cling to outdated hierarchies. In entertainment, this shift is already visible. African films, skits, podcasts, and documentaries increasingly feature English that is globally accessible, yet culturally grounded. Audiences from different continents understand and relate. Engagement grows, and creators realize they no longer need to code switch aggressively to be heard. The Filipino influence helped normalize this balance, proving that warmth and professionalism can coexist. In workplaces, the impact is even more tangible. African professionals are winning more international roles, leading global teams, teaching students across continents, and hosting audiences they once believed were unreachable. And as they succeed, they carry this evolved English with them, reinforcing its value and spreading it further. Some experts now suggest that what we are witnessing is the rise of a truly global English one, shaped not by any single country, but by shared human priorities, clarity, respect, empathy, and effectiveness. Filipino English helped model this future, and Africa is actively participating in shaping it. There is something deeply symbolic about this moment. Two regions once positioned as followers are now influencing how the world communicates, quietly redefining standards without asking permission. and in doing so, they are proving a powerful truth. Language evolves through use, not authority. So the next time you hear a young African speaking English with a soft tone, careful pronunciation, and gentle confidence, understand that you are hearing more than an accent. You are hearing history in motion, a global shift where voices once ignored are now shaping how the world listens. You are hearing the result of digital connection, shared experience, and cultural humility. You are hearing the Filipino way echoed through African voices, not as imitation, but as evolution. This story is not about English replacing local languages, and it is not about Africa losing its voice. It is about Africa refining it, strengthening it, and projecting it confidently onto the world stage, just as Filipinos did before, turning a borrowed language into a powerful tool of self-expression and opportunity. English no longer belongs to the West. It belongs to the people who use it to build bridges, to tell stories, to teach, to work, to laugh, and to connect. And today, millions of Africans are proving that with every conversation they have. And if you've made it this far, you are witnessing something special. A quiet cultural migration that didn't arrive through conquest or policy, but through screens, voices, and shared humanity. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see the world a little differently, take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories that reveal how cultures connect, influence, and shape our world in ways we never expect.